Hello, everybody, and welcome back to OMN Insights. My name is Soriti Kadia, and I'm your host. Today, we are going to be talking about the devastating droughts that has been engulfing much of the southern regions of Oromia and parts of northern Kenya, which is home to the Borana people. This drought actually stretches into eastern Oromia and is also affecting other parts of the Horn of Africa. But since last week, the situation has become incredibly dire in southern Oromia and northern Kenya, with communities now facing a critical famine. According to ReliefWeb, this is the worst drought that the region has seen in 40 years. In the report released by the organization in July 2022 and revised again in December of the same year, as a result of 4 and going on 5 back-to-back rainy seasons, the number of people in need of life-saving aid are at 16.99 million. And to give you a picture of how quickly this drought is expanding, this figure is approximately double the number of people affected at the beginning of 2022. So you can imagine the proportions of the crisis an entire year later. The communities affected are largely pastoralists and farmers, so the lack of rainfall means that the very means of survival, herding animals and growing food, has come under dramatic threat. According to the same report by ReliefWeb, an estimated 3.5 million livestock have died since 2021. Today, we are joined by Dr. Ibrahim Elemo to talk more about this ongoing crisis and about the emergency relief efforts that he, his organization, and partners are a part of coordinating. Dr. Ibrahim Elemo is the president-elect and a board member of the International Oromo Health Professionals Association, and he is also the managing director of Teltele Relief and Development Foundation, a not-for-profit organization established in the USA to provide humanitarian assistance such as emergency relief and to provide pastoralist children with access to education through the establishment of boarding schools across the southern regions of Oromia. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you for having me on your show. I appreciate the opportunity very much.
You're most welcome. So, Dr. Ibrahim, you have been through both the International Oromo Health Professionals Association and the Teltele Relief and Development Foundation, responding to this crisis really from the front lines for the last week and beyond that. And we will talk a little bit more about this emergency relief response you were coordinating a little bit later on. But firstly, this famine is not necessarily a new phenomenon. The region, as I said in the intro, is going on its 5th failed rainy season and has been facing critical climate conditions for years now, whilst receiving very little support or attention. But in this last week, the situation has become increasingly dire. Please help us understand what exactly has shifted to make this more of a critical emergency than it already was. And what is the feedback you're getting from your partners on the ground? Just generally give us a feeling of the extent of this situation.
I was born and raised in Borana. And I also went back and served in Borana for about 4 years as a general practitioner in Nagele Borana Hospital. Had the opportunity to study the culture and also the socio-political dynamics in Borana and the entire lowland districts of Oromia, as well as, the Somali region in Ethiopia, because we have similar sociocultural kind of dynamics. And when there is a drought in the Somali region or in Somalia, there has always been drought and famine in Borana. And we have been hearing about severe drought and famine-like situation in Somalia. And for us, people who happen to come from that region of the country, we have always been getting information that there has been severe drought, severe food insecurity, But what happened actually in the last 1 month or so was that some of us have been working very hard to try to raise awareness about the dire situation, especially about famine-like situation in Teltele district, which happens to be the district where we are from, which is the worst affected of all the districts in the Borana zone. So what happened was that one of our member, who happens to be on the board of IOPA, went to attend a conference in Haramaya University, which was organized by Haramaya University in collaboration with the IOPA leadership. So he had the opportunity to go down to Borana, to Teltele and Moyele, and during his brief stay, he was so shocked by what he saw there. He was so shocked by how students living in boarding, facilities do not have any food to eat, do not have any place to sleep, no mattress, no firewoods. And then he also saw that there are a large number of people who were internally displaced and living in or just around the main town. And these people are actually people from the rural areas who come to the town seeking help, begging. And sometimes he heard that some of the people do actually feed on, like the leftover, like, when you make this local liquor, there are residues that are considered to be a feed for animals. So human beings have been feeding on those type of stuff because of, lack of food to eat. That is a sign of severe food shortage and famine-like situation that happened in 1984, which was the last time we had seen a famine on like a biblical proportion where millions of Ethiopians were starving in the north, south, west, east. So that type of situation had happened when I was a child. It happened again in Borana this time. So that is what happened last few weeks. A large number of people fled the rural villages into the urban centers looking for help. So the government could not hide that problem any longer. The disaster had come to their doors. So that is what happened.
Thank you. We've been hearing that over this last 1 to maybe more weeks that people have actually started dying of starvation in this. Is this also what you're hearing?
Actually, a story of a village where I was actually raised. I happened to be born in a village which is about 7-8 kilometers from the main town where this district is located. And I was raised by my grandmother in a village about 10-12 miles from the town. And we heard that 4 people died from one household. Oh, a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old child were starving and were basically too weak. And the parents had nothing to offer for these kids. So the husband and the wife decided to go different directions to look for food. So the husband came to the town, and the wife went to another, like maybe village to beg for food. And when the husband came home with some food, he found his 2 kids dead inside the house. So he hanged himself right in front of the house. And when the wife came at night, she found that her 2 children and her husband were dead. So she too took her own life. She hanged herself from a tree, which was right out of their house. So that was a story that happened a little over a week ago in that district from one family, one village. So we have been hearing this type of stories of some elderly women and men dying. I will discuss about the Boran culture when it comes to who gets to eat first. That is something that the world needs to know. But yes, there are people who are dying, and probably the most people who died in Borana are probably from that district.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. Such a devastating story, but it really gives us an insight into how urgent the need is at the moment in the region. Now, interestingly, Dr. Ibrahim, in trying to get you for this interview, we were also trying to get a representative from the international emergency relief community broadly, just to join us. And this still might happen in the future, but the overall feedback was that there was sensitivity to discuss these things on the media by these institutions. And if I was to dare assume, I'd say that this is because there is probably being very little done by this very well-resourced and funded collective of organizations to address the crisis. Though I'd like to hear your views on this. From what you know about what's going on the ground, is the international emergency relief community responding to this now? And have they been doing so over the years of this crisis developing?
That's a very important question. For the last maybe 3-4 years, there has been a lack of peace and security in Guji and Borana zones. There has always been some kind of fighting, some kind of conflict, the same as what has been happening in West Oromia. So basically, the government would need to give security clearance for international organizations even to have a presence, to travel to areas like Borana to collect data. And even if they have data directly from sources that they trust, they cannot share this data unless the government signs, especially when it comes to also seeking international assistance. The government must declare that there is a disaster and that there is severe shortage of food and that some people are, facing famine or a famine-like situation. The government so far has never declared that there is famine and that there is large-scale displacement of human beings. The government has not declared until very recently that millions of livestock perished because of the drought. So basically, the international organizations who are licensed to operate in Ethiopia must closely work with the government, or you could call it the regime, so that they would have the legitimacy to stay and work there or operate in that country. So they oftentimes do not actually talk about this type of crisis unless they have the go-ahead from the government, or unless they have some kind of a presence in that type of environment. So my feeling is that most of the organizations do not have personnel on the ground, and therefore the information that they would give to the world may not be credible if they have never been there.
Yeah, thank you. And you raise a really important point regarding the government's role in facilitating, relief and resources into the region. And I'm remembering that because the conflict in these areas that you mentioned is predominantly between government forces and the Oromo Liberation Army. And in its recently released manifesto, the Oromo Liberation Army, in expressing its willingness to sit for peace talks with the government, mentioned as part of its security building measures and its confidence building measures that it would like a humanitarian corridor opened up into the Oromia region. And I am going to assume that includes, or if not, is directly talking about this famine going on in the southern regions. Do you think that the government's perhaps unwillingness to sit for negotiations with the OLA is part of exacerbating this crisis? Do you think that there'd be a difference in what we're seeing in the region if we were able to move towards the process of peace talks between the two parties?
You know, food security has never been about drought. If the government had resources, if there is good governance, the government would have the mechanism to actually prepare to respond to this type of crisis. They may have resources to actually kind of reallocate budget, buy food from where food is available, and make it available to regions where there is food insecurity. But the Ethiopian government currently has been facing severe budget deficits. There has been this a perennial conflict, this fighting. If I may tell you that to travel from Awasa to Borana, sometimes people must take like routes that are too kind of long, like through Arbaminch, the southern region, because moving to the Guji zone has been so problematic. There is sense of insecurity. And the same is true moving from Negele Borana to Moyale. Or the Borana region, or lowland, has two main territories: the Dire and the Liban, which is Yabello, one, and the lowland areas on that main highway from Finfinne to Nairobi. And then there is another major town, and you cannot travel from Negele Borana to Moyale because of the presence of large numbers of the Oromo Liberation Army. And also because there is also conflicts between, or there has never been a stable peace between the pro-Somali tribes and the Oromo groups. So there has not been peace and security in that region. And where there is no peace and security, the government, people cannot live in a kind of decent way. They cannot trade. So I would say the drought is one factor, the lack of good governance, the recurrent conflicts, as well as this rampant corruption, and the people who are in the position of authorities were actually indoctrinated to only talk about the aspirations of the regime, that Ethiopia will become a prosperous country, and that they were there to develop and not to talk about people not having anything to eat. That is not in the vocabulary of the political cadres and the leaders at all the levels. So I think this time they are talking about the crisis because the crisis is too big and it cannot be hidden anymore. I think that is why now the whole world, including the regime and its apparatus, started talking about the crisis, about the famine and the famine-like situation in many places, such as South Bale and some districts of the Guji zone. So I would say that, I was surprised that even in Bale zone, because the reality is that the lowlands of Bale, including districts like Madawalabu, Dire, Raitu, Dawe, these are all lowland areas that have the same socio-cultural and environmental factors like the Borana zone. So if there is famine in Borana, there is automatically famine-like situation or severe drought in that part of Oromia. So now we have started hearing about how bad the situation is in southern Bale, especially the districts that are pastoralist or semi-pastoralist.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. You've touched on quite a few things there. And as important as it is, and we will continue to talk about the emergency relief efforts that you're involved in to get more insight as to how people can help and how people can mobilize. And as important as that is, this region is most likely going to experience another failed rainy season this year. And this will really tip the crisis over the edge if we're not already there now. As necessary as emergency relief is in the foreseeable future, in your view, what has to be done long term to mitigate the crisis from actually all the perspectives that you mentioned in that previous answer in identifying the compounding issues that are causing this crisis?
You know, there's always a solution to a crisis like this, okay? We cannot always respond to crisis year after year. There is now a cycle of a drought and famine-like situation in Borana unless there is sustainable development interventions. We have started, I myself, 2016, when there was that huge Oromo protest, realizing that the people of my home district had no access to education, I had to actually establish this foundation to build a facility where students from the rural areas would have a place to live. And that facility was built as one way of, you know, not only responding to crisis, but if we educate and if the government, let's say, would have a development project where they would actually have development interventions such as, you know, irrigation in areas where people can farm, and for the pastoralist communities, making drinking water available within, let's say, short distance. And in Ethiopia, there has always been this thing called top-down, center-periphery development. There is nothing like the government would build a factory in Borana. It has to be somewhere close to the center. There is nothing like you build a boarding school in, let's say, Madawalabu. They just build it in Robe. And development has to just go from center to the periphery, and the periphery is always abandoned, and they are always at the mercy of the regime when crisis like this happens. So what I'm saying is there has to be more funds that need to be allocated, not handouts like now the Famine administration has allocated 100 million. That happens because they're in a country that has good governance. There cannot be a surplus in big places that we just can take and give to a region that has a problem. That happens because the whole economy is concentrated in the major urban centers, and that the government has done little to nothing to increase the livelihood, the household income of rural populations. So in Borana, I would say that the government would need to open the cross-border kind of a trade and build development corridors. It could be, you know, maybe, you know, there has been a huge project where the past PRF regime had even a project, a multi-billion project that was designed to harvest the underground water and take that water through pipelines to different districts of the zone and help people learn how to do some farming, or their livestock would have to, you know, be raised in a modern way. They don't have to wander from place to place. Borana doesn't have now the privilege of going to Somali region when there is drought, right? Because there is now this huge population, and pastoralism does not appear to be a viable way of life, not anymore. The Borana used to have access to a lot of regions, including going all the way to Somalia. Maybe 50, 60, 100 years ago, the Borana can go as far as they want. They used to be a hegemonic power. They used to have a peace alliance with the tribes, whereby during the time of a crisis like this, the Borana would have a land where they can take their livestock and save some of their livestock. And that is not there anymore because the land size has decreased over the decades. And now Borana is confined to these small few districts where they cannot move around as they wish. So there need to be development. I'm glad that now there is a university, but that university came very late, and I'm very sad to also know that the Borana zone happens to have one of the worst leadership crises in all of Oromia. Actually, for some of us who happen to know the realities from that zone, we have come to use this term that if the Prosperity Party in Ethiopia is bad, what we have in Borana is actually the worst. Those are, heartless. We actually call them heartless, corrupt, incompetent people who happen to feed on sometimes they could snatch food from the mouth of the starving people and sell it to some other merchants to just fill their belly. I don't have any reservation to tell the media that I wish someday when this crisis is all over, the regime, if it happens to be in power, they would check the leadership of the Borana zone and what is now the East Borana zone and examine the realities. And to me, those people who are there are worthless and heartless, and they don't deserve to stay in power. There are a lot of people more competent than them who could probably run that zone better than them.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. You articulated really well this dynamic between the center and the periphery and how that's exacerbating the crisis and the lack of resources that are really given to the grassroots to facilitate this development. I really found that very poignant. And I think it's also worth mentioning, we're not going to go into this today, but in response to this crisis in leadership in the region, actually in the last few days, we've seen young people coming out in protest around some administrative decisions that have been made. Again, it's not a conversation for now. But yes, I appreciate your answer. All in all, as we come to the end of our interview, Dr. Ibrahim, over this last week, the Oromo nation, both in the country and the diaspora, has mobilized to respond to this crisis. And the International Oromo Health Professionals Association, where you're the president-elect and a board member, has been a part of this. And on the 27th of February, you announced in a statement made directly on the Facebook page of IOPA, and I quote, it says, "We have made an announcement that the International Oromo Health Professionals Association's Board of Directors passed a resolution to establish a task force to coordinate the Borana famine relief and emergency food assistance delivery to the affected areas and communities of the Oromia lowland districts in Borana and Guji zones." The statement goes on to also say that you're partnering with local organizations and individuals to provide this emergency assistance for everybody that wants to help, whether it is the community in the diaspora, whether it's in the country, whether it's outside the Oromo community, whether it is the international or regional media or political community. How can people best support these local emergency efforts like what you are coordinating, and really practically, what is going to make your work of reaching people with life-saving aid easier in this really critical time?
Thank you for asking that very important question. The IOPA organization for the last maybe 3-4 years has been the organization that coordinates relief, kind of the diaspora response to the crisis in the Oromia region, especially following the death or the assassination of Hachalu Hundessa, when hundreds, if not thousands, of young people were killed, and there was little to nothing to help mitigate the crisis or probably provide medical assistance to those. We were there. We organized the entire Oromo diaspora communities relief programs and sent money to different zones. And we had an operation even under that difficult circumstance, where even sending money at that time back home was not permitted. We did actually provide a lot of assistance, hundreds of thousands of dollars that we were able to get from the Oromo communities. And this time, I have to say that one of our most senior surgeon and physician, Dr. Gudeta, who happened to be the founding member of this association, came to me and he said, we do know that there are a lot of organizations and individuals who would be interested in helping or who would pledge to help. But we have learned from our mistakes how these type of operations were handled in the past. He said, you have to step up and lead this response. We have started reaching out to our members, to the Oromo community organizations in diaspora here in the USA, North America, and we would like to coordinate. We don't want to be the implementers by ourselves, but we have local partners, including my own organization that has personnel on the ground. And I was born there. I was raised there. I have actually worked within the government organization for some time. So I do know how resources that are mobilized could be misused or mishandled or corrupted. And we do understand that this need is going to be there for a long haul, right? For months, if not years. So whatever resources that we get, we cannot just say, oh, we have given this type of assistance for this week or for this month, and then we are done. No, we need to strategize, and we need to actually sustain our financial assistance. And we have been asking people to put their money in one basket, and we trust our local partners, but we verify. There is a saying in the West that trust but verify. That is exactly what we were doing. We were the first people to actually help the people in Teltele, but what we did was we did not ask for the Oromo community, the larger Oromo community, to help. We tried to just fundraise from our family members and friends, and we did showcase that if we get some fund, we do rush that fund and make the food available to the most needy. So I think I would say that we will try to work with local organizations, including the local government bodies that oversee, but we do not leave this task to them alone. They have, as a government, the responsibility to oversee, but I do believe that civil organizations and we, the educated people, the people with the resource, we have to rush our donations and also hold organizations, individuals who pledged funds accountable. We have to ask how much of the fund was collected. Where was it used? And how many people were supported? So we have to verify how much fund was collected, how it was dispersed, and when these funds are utilized, when it's given, we have to say, show us the proof. Just don't show us the tracks that went to Borana. Just show us where it was delivered and show us how many people were actually supported. And also, in the long run, we need to know how the government or government and non-government organizations are going to sustain this emergency food assistance over the coming months, maybe through the end of this year, because we are not expecting that people who lost maybe 80% of their livestock will have enough even resources to produce, let's say, food, and this food insecurity will be there for months, if not years to come. And we need to do a good job of making sure that we advocate for our people and we hold all the organizations accountable for what they are doing when they're addressing this problem in Borana, Bale, and other zones of Oromia and beyond.
Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Ibrahim, and for your work in this really urgent time. I appreciate you, and I wish you all the best as you continue to coordinate these efforts.
Thank you, and I call upon all of our friends and the Oromo organizations and the rest of the Ethiopian community organizations in the world to stand with us, because this is about humanity. I'm not making this appeal only to the Oromos. So we would like international organizations to actually have some presence, and because we know that the resources that we could collect from the diaspora alone or from the government alone may not be enough to feed hundreds of thousands of people for several months. So we are asking for the government to allow international organizations to begin operating in these areas to mitigate this crisis for the months, if not for the years to come.
Thank you. Yes, this is going to require a comprehensive and collaborative response across multiple institutions for us to really meet the extent of this need. And I also will really emphasize the point that you made earlier, that this is about, well, this to be effective, this relief effort to be most effective is about partnering with people who are on the ground. And so I, again, want to spotlight your work in building those relationships, transparent relationships that are based on accountability, for all people involved, and really encourage people and institutions, multi-sector institutions, government and non-government, to plug into efforts that, again, are working with people directly on the ground. Again, I really thank you for your time today, Dr. Ibrahim.
It's a pleasure to be on the show.
That was a deeply insightful and really at some points disturbing interview to listen to, simply because it gives us such insight into the extent of the human crisis that the famine in southern Oromia is. And so we're going to continue talking about this crisis over the coming weeks, particularly because it is important that with a number of social and political issues exacerbating these conditions, we must locate this crisis in the context of the global climate crisis and of the country's political and the region's political crisis. And this is really about considering long-term strategies to alleviate this suffering hand in hand with supporting immediate relief efforts. Now, we'll be having that conversation along with more conversations questioning and holding accountable the role of the international community and the government in this crisis. If you can, I strongly encourage you to donate to the ongoing relief efforts in the region. The International Oromo Health Professionals Association is one reliable pathway to do that. And there are a number of local organizations and partners that are on the ground supporting people. And in this time, no donation is too small. Thank you for tuning in. You are watching OMN Insight, and I'm your host, Soreti Kadia, and I look forward to being with you next time.